Hello everybody and welcome to my guide to Maven in Path of Exile. The build I'm going to be using for it is a build I refer to as Mamachongus. It is an Elementalist Golemancer that uses 4 Carrion Golems, 1 Stone Golem, 1 Chaos Golem, it has Skitterbots, and then it has 4 Syndicate Operatives for some additional DPS and clear. It's focused mostly on survivability through high amounts of armor, a lot of elemental mitigation, and the DPS between all the minions is about 1.5 million. And finally, it also regenerates about 1000 life per second, and if you want to know more about it, there is a pastebin in the video description. So the Maven fight is fairly straightforward and it gets significantly easier if you have a lot of DPS. Personally, I would say the fight starts to feel good if you can bring a consistent DPS output of about 1 million, with it starting to feel really great if you have 1.5 or more. But anyway, in the first phase you're going to be fighting the humanoid version of Maven, who has a couple of attacks that are fairly easy to dodge, and they're also very well telegraphed because she will say a specific voice line before every attack. There is the Cascade of Pain, after which she will track you with a barrage of projectiles that hit pretty hard but are also fairly easy to avoid if you simply step side to side in relation to Maven or you run circles around her. There is the Stay Still attack, which is a terrible advice for what she's about to do, because this attack will have her spawn 2 sets of 3 lines apart from each other. They will come together in like a scissor motion on top of you, and all you need to do to avoid these is to simply zigzag between them. And finally, there are some random balls rotating around the arena which don't do an awful lot of damage, so you can eat one every now and then. However, the humanoid version of Maven can sometimes say mine, which will take all the balls and send them flying towards you and start exploding. And the best way to deal with this is to just keep moving so they explode behind you. And that's pretty much all the humanoid version of Maven will do in this first phase. This is all fairly easy to dodge, and it's not really the important part of the first phase. The more important part here is what I call the brain version of Maven that's constantly rotating around the arena. Because this douchebag doesn't really have any distinct voice lines for announcing its attack, so you just have to keep an eye out for what it's doing. So firstly, it will send out a barrage of projectiles in a cone that don't do a lot of damage, are fairly easy to dodge, and you can eat a couple of them with no problem. Once these explode, they will turn into the smaller balls that then start rotating on the outside of the arena. Then it can send out a set of 1 type of large ball, which will stop after a while and send out smaller projectiles, which upon contact will leave degen on the ground. And I would highly recommend you place this degen in the center of the arena for easier maneuvering in the next phase. And finally, you can send out a different type of large ball, which will just do a little bit of damage on impact, and they sort of arc through the arena. The most important thing in this phase, aside from, not being hit by all the things and dying very early on, is to make sure that the degen is placed in a sensible spot. Whether you want to put it in the center of the arena, which I would highly recommend, or the outside of the arena if that works better for you, just try to stack it in one spot, because in the next phase you have to do circles around the arena, and if you have degen everywhere, you're just gonna die. This is not like too punishing if you screw it up in the beginning, because the floor is gonna get wiped off the degen twice, but if you screw it up later on, you will have to deal with the degen until the end of the fight, which will make it much harder, and trust me, you don't want to make the end of this fight any harder. Once the humanoid version of Maven runs out of health, the second phase will start, where the brain version of the Maven flies into the center of the arena and starts channeling an explosion. This will just straight up one-shot you. However, at the same time, the rotating rings that are on the outside of the arena will stop, and you can go there to avoid being one-shot by the explosion. Once the explosion goes off, you can go back into the center of the arena because the brain is now targetable and you can start damaging it. However, at the same time, 2 beams on either side of the brain will start rotating around the arena. Now, these beams won't just straight up one-shot you, they instead turn off your recovery, so if you accidentally touch them, you will have to play it safe for the next 10 seconds until the debuff runs out. Your goal here is to simply run circles around the arena to avoid the beams while doing as much damage to the brain as possible, and also not dying to the random map bosses that are going to be spawning throughout the entire phase. The set of bosses you have to deal with in this phase is chosen randomly for each fight, so in one Maven fight you might have to deal with the Devourer and Kitava, whereas in another one you might have Fat Dodrid that is a giant vulnerability aura that stretches across almost the entire arena. The difficulty on this phase is based on 2 things. 1, how well you place the degens, because if you painted the entire floor, it's going to be much more difficult because you're going to be taking damage from the degen on top of all the bosses. And 2, the type of the build you're doing this with and how much damage that build has. On this build, for example, this phase is much harder than it was on my Earthquake character, where I would just blow the bosses up with every Earthquake. Ultimately, ultimately you just need to keep your cool and damage the boss as much as possible while avoiding the beams and not dying to the random map bosses. Once you push the brain down to about 70% health, the next phase will start, where the humanoid version of Maven once again comes into the arena and the brain moves to the side. This is where Simon Says comes in. So Maven will flash different sections of the arena and you have to repeat the pattern or you're gonna get one shot. In this case, it's right, top and left. This starts off fairly simple because the sequence is very short and there is not much else you have to worry about, but it gets more difficult later on. Now, an important thing here is that once she says scurry scurry, which is your cue to repeat the pattern, a circle will start expanding from the center of the arena. This is an extremely deadly degen that will detonate once it reaches the outside of the arena, so if you're too slow, you're gonna get one shot. But this circle will also detonate when you finish the sequence, so make sure you're not standing in it when you're doing the final step. And the second new mechanic that gets added in this third phase is that every now and then the brain version of Maven will telegraph a giant line across the arena, and it will, after a few seconds, do a lot of damage in that area, so simply stay out of it. And other than that, this phase is exactly the same as the first phase. You simply add Simon Says and the giant telegraph that you have to stay out of. The most important thing at this point is once again the degen, aside from, of course, once again not dying to random stuff and screwing up Simon Says and being one shot. Because if you misplace the degen now, not only are you making the next brain phase more difficult, you're also making the next Simon Says section more difficult. This is where DPS really starts to matter, because not only are you gonna get fewer degens if you're doing more damage, you're also gonna get fewer Simon Says sections. And the Simon Says mechanic is most likely what's gonna wipe you on this fight, because the sequence gets longer every time and there's also more and more mechanics that get added that you have to keep track of at the same time. Because this is what you're going to be dealing with at the end, but we're getting ahead of ourselves, so let's rewind a little bit. Once you defeat Maven again, the second phase will repeat, so the brain will fly to the center of the arena and you have to go to the outside ring to avoid the initial explosion. Then you once again have to avoid the beams, avoid the degen, deal with the random map bosses that are going to be spawning throughout while dealing as much damage to the brain as you can. There are, as far as I know, no new mechanics in this phase. It's literally just phase 2 all over again. And the goal here is to bring the brain down to about 30% health. Once you do that, the brain will go to the side and fully healed Maven will come back in. Now this phase is pretty similar to the previous Maven phase, with the exception that Maven can now do a chevron type slam, which is indicated by the line, "Do what I say." The slam has a pretty long charge up time, so you should have no trouble getting out of it before it does damage. And the only other thing that changes is that the Simon Says sequence gets longer, though that's kind of like a constant throughout the entire fight. The more she does it, the longer it gets. So at this point for me, the sequence was right up, right up, right up, rather than right up, left as it was in the beginning. The most important thing in this phase, outside of not dying and screwing up the Simon Says mechanic, is once again going to be the degen placement. It's even more important this time around because the floor will no longer reset, so you will have to deal with the degen until the end of the fight, meaning that if you really screw it up at this time, the end of the fight is going to be much harder for you. This is where the fight starts to get difficult because there is more and more stuff you have to read correctly and keep track of. But as long as you keep your cool, you keep damaging the boss and you pay attention to the Simon Says mechanic, you should have no trouble pushing into the next phase. So once you defeat Maven for the third time, the second phase will repeat. So the brain will fly to the center, you have to go to the outside rings to avoid the initial explosion. Once the explosion goes off, you go back into the arena, you want to avoid the beams, you want to avoid the degen, try not to die to the map bosses, and do as much damage to the brain as possible. And your goal at this point is to kill the brain. Once the brain is down, Maven will come in for the last time. Now this phase, as you can probably tell by looking at the video, is a little bit different to the previous one. So the humanoid version of Maven will still do the same stuff she did up until now. So she will do the Simon Says mechanic, she will do the chevron type slam, she will do the barrage, she will do the scissor beams and all that. But in addition to all of that, she can now also say take this and hurl a giant fireball in your direction, which does insane damage on hit. So try to sidestep that as best as you can. Now, since the brain is a bit dead, it's no longer doing any of its previous mechanic, and it instead rotates 5 beams around the arena with narrow openings that bounce from the center to the outside of the arena and back. These are the same as the 2 beams from the previous brain phases, so they don't do a ton of damage, but they turn off your recovery, meaning that if you touch them accidentally, you're gonna have to play it safe for the next 10 seconds. And at this point, that's kind of rough. What's also rough is the Simon Says mechanic, because at this point, point the sequence is pretty long and there is a lot more stuff to keep an eye on at the same time. And depending on how good you are, how much damage you're doing, and how many portals you have left, there are kind of like 3 things you can do here. You can A, be very calm and collected and go, okay, so left, right, top, left, right, scurry, scurry, alrighty then, to the right, and to the top, to the left, to the right, and let's stay out of the big boom, top, done. Or if you have enough portals going into the final phase, you can do B, which is taking advantage of a bit of a design flaw in the fight, because she won't do the Simon Says section until you get it right. She will just do it once and then continue doing whatever she was doing, so you can just log out, log back in, teleport back into the fight, and since the invulnerability period isn't shortened, you can just let it explode while you have the invulnerability period and continue with the fight, though this does require you to have enough DPS to do it before you run out of portals. Or you can do C, left, right, up, what? Left, up, what? Dude, this game is bullshit! So essentially B, just without the intent. Sometimes I do feel fancy and I go for A, but generally I will just do B, so I will log out as soon as possible because I can comfortably get to the final phase with all the portals and I have enough damage to just, do it on like 2 or 3 portals, so that's what I do because it's the simplest way and I'm not very good at keeping track of a lot of mechanics at the same time, so logging out and avoiding it is the best way to do it for me. But I have a feeling it might get adjusted so that you can't do this anymore, so just in case you can't avoid it by logging out or just, face planting into the boss, just go for A and try to keep an eye out for the Simon Says mechanic. And that is pretty much it for Maven, so I thank you very much for watching as always guys, I wish you good luck with Maven, I hope you've enjoyed the video and it was helpful, and I'll see you some other time. Bye bye.